First of all, I want to thank all of you for your feedback on the survey, particularly the candid feedback. It was really helpful. The things that aren't working, it's great. I really appreciate you taking the time and putting yourselves out there to tell me. That helps quite a bit. And I appreciate the positive feedback as well, but the constructive work really helps change things. So thank you for that. Second, some of you may have received what should have been audio comments or voice comments on your papers that didn't work. So sorry about that. I will figure out what happened and then go through and do it again. If you have any questions in the meantime, let me know. I was hoping that would be a way to get prompt feedback to you. So I'll just need to tweak the tech issue there and get it working. Okay, so for today, we have a couple of TED Talks. Do you have a volunteer? Anybody want to go first?
Give me one sec.
Sure.
All right, I'm ready. Okay. I'm Brad, and this is my presentation on Chandigarh. Take a second and soak in this building. I'm going to be talking about it a lot. It is the capital complex of the city. This is like where they do most of their government stuff. But overall, just a really cool building. Just keep it in mind. Come on, change. All right, so a little bit of background. It's the earliest planned city in post-independence India. It was finished building in 1960. It is widely known for its architecture and its urban design. That building I just showed you guys was put on the UNESCO World Heritage Site list in 2016. And it was designed by French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier, who adopted plans of Polish architect Maciej Nowicki and American planner Albert Meyer. It's located in northwest India. If you look at that map, it's right there. And that's pretty important. I'm going to talk about that right now. So a little bit of history of the city. After India gained their independence in 1947, the former British province of Punjab was divided into two different provinces. If you look at this map on the right here, we can see that this shaded region was the previous entire Punjab region, and this city right here, Lahore, was the capital. We'll talk about that. That's important. But yeah, so obviously there was a lot of bloodshed and violence that came along with the separation of this province. If we look on the right here, we can see the movement of refugees to their respective ethnic areas and all of the conflict that kind of goes around the side. So when the region was divided, the capital city, Lahore, ended up on the Pakistan side of it, creating a new need for a new capital city on the India side, as well as a place to house a lot of the refugees that were coming in. So the demand for a city that was well designed, very thought out, and almost an upgrade from the other one was like super relevant. And so that's exactly what they did. They came up, like Corbusier came up with this idea for a human body design of the city. If we look right here on this map at the bottom, at the very top here, this is supposed to be the head of the city. This is where all the government buildings are. A building such as the one above it, that's actually the court building of the city. That would have been at the head. Additionally, we can see a lot of the green spaces that run down through the city. This was designed to be the lungs. And we can see this center, this gray building right here. This was designed to be the heart. This was like a hub of transportation and just like shopping and pretty much everything you want in the center. Additionally, we can see that it was divided into sectors. Each one was about 250 acres. And these little red dots with the numbers, I know it's really hard to see, I'm sorry, but those would be where educational, medical, and cultural institutions were evenly spread out throughout the city. Also, we can see that, you know, no matter where you are in the city, you're going to have some access to green space. It's all over the place. And they even went farther and planted trees all throughout the city to help like kind of alleviate the hotness of their summer. So I'm going to talk about these green spaces now. So the green spaces were, you know, originally designed to be the lungs of the city. They were designed to segregate the traffic of the city. But given the gradual slope of the land, they were able to easily take advantage of it and use it for the purpose of drainage. Whenever I like studied planned cities with a lot of green spaces, you always kind of hear about how they impact the lives of the people who live there and just kind of like the quality of life. So I did a little research on Chandigarh, and I found that it's the cleanest city in India. The people who live there have the highest per capita income. It's the happiest city in India, and it's home to 1.6 million people, which is a little surprising. If you look at that design that I showed you, I mean, it was mostly green space. It didn't really look like a lot of people, like there was a lot of room for people to live. So the fact that they could plan out room for 1.6 million people to live there is very impressive in my opinion. Um, and a little bit about their architecture. We can see, if you remember that building I showed you on the title side again, it was also made of stone and concrete, just like these ones. We can see that they use a modern design style that's also a little abstract. Additionally, we can see that they were very fond of using green space and water features to enhance the aesthetic of their buildings. Once again, if you remember that first building, the Capitol complex, it was like reflecting off the water, almost made it look twice as big. The same thing is kind of going on with this building right here on the bottom. Additionally, a little bit about this monument up top. This is called the Open Hand Monument. It is the symbol of their city. It represents their desire to welcome others and their willingness to help their neighbors during times of need. And as we can tell from their history, you know, given the fact that they took all of these refugees and they built this city together, like it really is symbolic of their history. And I think it's really neat. And that's my presentation. Thank you guys for listening. Sweet.
Terrific. Questions, feedback, comments? Have you heard about Chandigarh before? What do you think about the idea of a planned city, starting from scratch? Good idea? Problematic? Terrible
I think
idea.
it's really interesting how this city has seemed to work, and then we like spent a lot of time prepping and like looking at Brasilia yesterday for today's class, and that seemed to have kind of failed miserably.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how like maybe it works sometimes and maybe it doesn't work other times, and kind of that depends on the design and the motivations of the city itself.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it also depends on the history that you gather. There was a period when Chandigarh was a total disaster. It had chain link fences all over the place, protests, graffiti, just people hated the fact that it was so restrictively organized that there couldn't be like the same problem as with Brasilia. You couldn't kind of make the city or the neighborhoods your own. And then UNESCO funding came in, things got cleaned up, there's a little reorganization. So it also depends on what period of time we're looking at. What about Ellen?
I was going to say, I think it's interesting how they choose like the human body or like a bird as like their city plan. Like they choose live objects to base their living on.
Yeah. Do you want to say more about that?
I just thought it was interesting because I don't know, I would think it'd be more based on like grid plans like we'd seen in like past things, because those seem to work and they seem to be very organized.
Yeah.
And this is just a very different way of doing things. And you don't know if it's going to be successful or not.
Yeah. Great point. So Le Corbusier was a huge fan of this kind of anthropomorphic plan for the city. When he planned small towns for the countryside, whether they were ever executed or not, they always had the sort of executive functions of the city as the head of the city, and then there were arms, legs, feet, etc., that were doing the work sort of to supply blood and energy to the head. It's a weird way of thinking about a city. There's a very explicit hierarchy implied there in what's happening as well. So great point, Ellen. What about the park space, those lungs? We've sort of touched on this before. What do you think? What do you think about a green space as lungs of a city?
It kind of reminds me of Central Park, just like how they felt the need to have some sort of green space, some place where you can sort of escape the metropolis of a city. And that's happening all over the world.
Yeah,
multiple cities have big.
Great connection to Central Park. Any other cities that it reminds me of? Oh, Christina, I could see you're muted.
Sorry about that.
No.
I was going to say the same thing about Central Park. It reminds me of that too, and it makes me wonder like the Seneca Valley video that we watched, what was maybe taken away from the inputting of that green space, or what had to be sacrificed for it.
Yeah, so in another class, in a biocolonial class that I do, we really dig into this history of parks as lungs, because there's this idea came out of France in particular, the idea that cities needed social hygiene. The city needed to be cleaned, just like our hands or whatever needed to be cleaned. And specifically, particular populations, as we saw in the case of Seneca, in the minds of these groups, needed to be cleansed. And the racial intention there is explicit. And it's explicit too in India. It was explicit in the design of many of the major cities of Latin America. This idea of lungs as green space, they were always put in a place to purify poor industrial neighborhoods. They were never put in the elite neighborhoods. You'll find parks there, but those were never designed as lungs. So there's a crazy history here, very problematic history. But now, of course, we're just happy to have the green space. It provides a great escape, as you said, Brad, and it provides an important ecological function for the city too. So it has its pluses and minuses. Okay, good. Any other thoughts on that? Thanks for your presentation, Brad. That was compelling and well done.
Thank you.
Okay, next up. Who had volunteered next? Now I've completely forgotten. Gabby, thank you. Let's see.
Yeah.
Brad, can you pass the hosting function to Gabby?
All right, you should have me.
Yeah, I got it. Sorry, I've never shared my screen before.
Oh, no problem. It's all of this is glitchy as we first start to do it. By the end of next semester, it'll be old hat.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, perfect. So I will be talking about the Alvorada Palace in Brasilia. Oh, it doesn't change. There you go. The word Alvorada is Portuguese for dawn, daybreak, or sunrise. The original name for the building that I will show now was called the Presidential Palace, but it was renamed after a quote from Juscelino Kubitschek, and it was in Portuguese, and it said, que é Brasilia señal alvorada de novo dia para o Brasil. And in English, that means, what is Brasilia if not the dawn of a new day for Brazil? So the capital is located in Brasilia, Brazil, and the idea of the entire city itself actually came to a saint that lived in Brazil in his dream in the 19th century. And after around 1956, the dream became possible with Kubitschek turning to Brazil's master architect, which built the capital. The palace is currently the home to the president of Brazil, whose name is Jair Bolsonaro, and the building was actually the first of many of the governmental buildings that are now in Brasilia. The architect's name was Oscar Niemeyer, he actually lived to be 104 years old, and he wanted to create something simple and very modern. Niemeyer is very well known throughout Brazil for creating abstractly modern buildings and architecture. He had what many called a utopian vision for the country, and many of his pieces seemed to levitate off the ground and seemed very lightweight. He also liked to incorporate a woman's curves into it and didn't really like harsh right angles. The building is 2 stories and it has a basement. It's about 79,000 square feet, and it was originally built in June 30th of 1958 and renovated more recently in 2005. Sorry, my dog is in the background. The first lady of 2004, Marisa Leticia, spearheaded a historical restoration of the palace, and she wanted everything restored to its original form and style, except she understood that it needed a couple renovations, including the air system and the heating system. But the building itself inspired a modern movement throughout the entire country of Brazil. So this is the building, and this is the coat of arms of Brazil. And so the columns symbolize the new capital and are present in the flag of Brazil and in the coat of arms. As you can see, the columns in the picture to the right is the same shape of the coat of arms. So the building is constructed of marble and glass, and the architect uses water for decoration. He chose marble because of its lightweight appearance, and the water reflects symmetric shapes in the water and imitates something that glass would do, creating an illusion of the building being taller than it actually is. The makeup of the mansion includes a basement where there's an auditorium, a laundry area, and a medical center. And that's where a lot of the administrative parts of the government take place. The ground floor is where a lot of the receptions for the president take place. And the second floor is occupied by the main residence where the president and his family lives. And there's also 6 other apartments and private rooms on the second floor. The building also includes a library. That's the building again. The building also includes a library, a heated swimming pool, a music room, 2 dining rooms, and then attached, we see that it has like a helicopter area and a chapel. I can show that in this picture right here. You can see how there's one main building. The picture to the bottom left, there's one main building, and off to the side it has different structures with it. That concludes my presentation.
Great. Well done, Gabby. Thank you. And your language skills are so appropriate and fantastic. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So questions, comments, feedback? Yes, Meredith.
I thought the columns were actually really cool because like you said, I think they were trying to like go for a more modern feel, but it also like was able to like give a modern feel, but like use like the country's history to create that modern feel, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Gabby. Thanks for bringing that to the fore. Also, so many of you in your comments about concrete with Tado Ando's Pulitzer building, it appealed to a few. I love the building, so I'm in that camp, but also I totally understand the people who are like, this looks cold and really, unwelcoming and forbidding and bleh. Niemeyer, in his work in Brasilia and his work across Brazil, in fact, is really he's feeling that too, from all of the concrete brutalism, functionalist architecture, and is, as Gabby said, trying to put curves, a softness into that material. For those who found Ando's buildings off-putting, or that building off-putting, did this palace, it's basically like the White House of Brazil, was that more appealing for you, or still too cold? And that's what makes Niemeyer such an icon of the modern movement. He really tried to push and do something different, and we see that sort of feminization of architectural form, as we saw even in the columns of Greco-Roman architecture, giving a building a softness and approachability. So the other thing to note, and I think I've just said it, in that terrific slide, Gabby, where you do have the coat of arms on the left and then the replicated forms on the right, did you notice what those forms are replacing? Like in historic architecture, what have they? Yeah, exactly. They're the columns. So he's taken, as so many modern architects do, they look back at the early histories of architectural forms, and it's just really kind of a long story of trying to innovate on that earliest architectural temple form. So we see that coming to the fore too in the way that this palace is structured. Like the White House, there's an attempt to imbue a history there, an idea of democracy, an idea of also sort of temple worshipful space that those early Greek temples symbolized. Good. What else? Anything else in that? Okay, well done. Thank you very much, Gabby. Now, Sophie, Matthew, okay.
So we can go first. That's fine.
Okay, great. Gabby, will you go to the participants? Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Unité d'habitation. And so the Unité d'habitation is not just one building, but it's rather an architectural principle that was designed by Le Corbusier following World War II. And so there are actually 5 Unités d'habitation, and the first one, which I'm mainly going to be talking about today, is located in Marseille, France. And there are 3 more in France, as well as one in Berlin. And so these buildings are largely viewed as one of the most influential buildings of the 20th century, not only because Le Corbusier designed them and he was considered to be one of the great architects at the time, but also because these propelled the idea of modern architecture and kind of introduced the idea of mass housing to Europe. So mass housing was not super popular at the time during Europe, and even though this was not the case, Le Corbusier had been kind of designing mass housing projects, not necessarily actually creating them, but he had been working on them for decades in advance. So prior to World War II, no one was really interested in building these projects, but following the Second World War, the French government decided to fund his Unité d'habitation because they were trying to solve some of the housing issues that World War II created and alleviate some of the slums of Europe. So not only was his 17-story design really innovative for the time period, but he also included a lot of different elements that weren't usually seen in buildings at the time. So here you can see the image of the pilotes, which are kind of like pillars, which have raised the building off the ground and kind of created this communal space underneath the building itself. And he also decided to use this technique because the Unité d'habitation was completely surrounded by a park. So he wanted to still have this sort of flow underneath the building, so it's not like he completely alienated the park by putting this building in the middle of it. But even more interesting than this was how he chose to design the apartments. So on the right-hand side, you can see a section of the building, and you'll notice that the apartments are kind of in an L shape. So part of the apartment is 2 stories high, and the rest just covers the entire length of the building. And one of the reasons that he chose to do this was to minimize the amount of hallways or corridors that were in the building itself. So there's really only one every 3 stories, which connect the apartment units. And this was done because this really helped maximize the living space in these tall buildings so more people could live in them. And so there are about 1,500 people that were living in this apartment building. But another reason he chose to do these L-shaped buildings was that our apartments, because every single apartment would then have a balcony, because at the time there was a really big concern about all these people living in one building and not having as much access to outdoor space. So having these balconies kind of alleviated that problem. But another really interesting thing that he chose to do, which you can see in this section, is on the 7th and 8th floor, he created these shopping streets. So there are all sorts of shops in the building, but he also included elements of a gym and a kindergarten as well as a hotel. So essentially everything that you could possibly need was in your own building. So there was a lot for people to leave. But even though he had all these really great innovative ideas, including soundproofing between the apartments, there were definitely some issues with the construction of his building, and this is mostly because of his use of the modular man as his measurement system. So the modular man was created by Le Corbusier himself, which he modeled on the 6-foot man, and he pretty much used this almost exclusively as the measurement system for his building, and this was really problematic in terms of the ceiling heights. So the ceilings were way lower than what was required by the French government, and even though they kind of let that slide because he was building this building for government purposes. It wasn't necessarily comfortable for people who were living in it. If you look at some images, the ceilings are really low, even for someone who might be shorter than 6 feet. So this was not really ideal and an already cramped living situation. So people were not a huge fan of that at the time. And this is also kind of one of the reasons why the Unité d'Habitation was not necessarily seen as the most successful project. And that's because the Unité d'Habitation was made for the purpose of replication. So this wasn't just supposed to be one building. This was supposed to be a solution for a housing problem throughout France and Europe. So the idea was that it would be easily replicated, whether that was in the architecture itself and as well as being built in a timely manner and more economically savvy. But that wasn't necessarily the case in the building of the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille. So it took way more time than anticipated and cost way more money than anticipated. So it wasn't necessarily a project that was easily replicated, even though we did see it was replicated 4 times after the initial building. There were a lot of modifications to those buildings from the original one. But that being said, the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille is still viewed as one of the most influential buildings of the time, and it is UNESCO Heritage Site, and people come from all over the world to view the amazing architecture and what he was able to do with the combination of concrete and brick, and create this high-rise building, which was really innovative at the time. And there's still a hotel in there, so you can go and visit it and see all the amazing things that Le Corbusier was able to do. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation.
Excellent, Sophie. Thoughts, feedback on this building?
It was like kind of giving me, I wouldn't be surprised if like buildings in America were going to be start to like have the same kind of feel after Corona, just because like having everything like inside and like the balcony, so everyone has a balcony so they can go outside, like stores inside, kindergarten in the same building. It's like, I feel like right now that's like a very like a dream. Right now.
Oh, that's such a great point. That is such a great point. It's so true, because you could be safely mixing and mingling only with the same people and not spreading things outside the building. Really nice. Great observation. Anything else? Do you feel like you've seen this building before or something similar to it? What comes to mind?
It sort of reminds me of a dorm at a much larger school.
Totally.
It's kind of cramped, but everyone still gets a tiny little piece of the outdoors.
Yep, exactly. Good. Anything else? Yeah, stay fun.
It kind of reminds me of like the 6 Feet Man that we mentioned in the brick section, and how the building material related to human scale.
Exactly. That's the exact same one. It's the modular in French, or the modular man in English. So great observation. And part of the problem with the building, as Sophie mentioned, was just, you can call him Corb or Corbu for short. That's like the name. Corbu's ego was so big that he thought, well, if I like it, everyone else will have to live with it, And so those short ceilings, or he made everything in the building, down to the furniture that Sophie showed, that lounge chair. Like, there is nothing that was not crafted by his hand, and that's not unusual for architects. So I'm not calling him out for that. A lot of architects want to design every single detail, but Le Corbusier, and I'm going to put the link down here for you for this if you're interested. It's now becoming quite known that he worked with the Vichy regime and a group of eugenicists in France to further the idea that not only could genetic modification, so-called improve the human body toward this ideal of perfection, but that architecture played a key role in doing that. He was part of this group of thinkers who followed the ideas of Lamarckian eugenics, the idea that your milieu, or the environment you live in, can shape the human form. And he really took this to the extreme, and that's part of what that modular represents. And most of his architecture follows that too. The other type of building that really took Corbu's plan and ran with it are the housing developments. And let me send you another link for that too, to a great article in The Guardian, if you're interested. Just housing developments generally for populations living in cities, again, lower income, industrial workers. We think of them now as like mass slums, but they were designed in the beginning to be this ideal form of housing that would have everything all inside. Again, a lot of that was racialized with the idea that those populations would then be contained and wouldn't be part of the broader public. But Pruitt-Igoe is one such circumstance, and if you watch, just find a YouTube video on it if you're interested. Spectacular failure to the point where they actually blew up the buildings and demolished them completely in order to start over. So you see, from the ideal of hope and future and improvement of humanity to total collapse. And there's a lot of history in between. But great job, Sophie. Thank you for that. And now let's see, Matthew? Great.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I think I changed it to the wrong person.
I've got it all.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
See how this goes. Great, so I will be taking it back to ancient Rome today, talking about the Pantheon that we talked or looked a lot at yesterday. So I'm going to try to bring in some new information, and you might have a little bit of repeated information as well. So the Pantheon is the best preserved architectural monument of the Roman period, and Pantheon means all divine. There is a really complicated history surrounding the building, and its origins are not entirely clear. So it was first believed that Marcus Agrippa, a consul of Rome during the 1st century BCE, originally had it built there to commemorate a victory that him and Augustus had. And after a series of fires, it was partially rebuilt under Emperor Domitian in the 80th CE decade, and then under Trajan again. And for a long time, historians actually thought it was built by Hadrian, but historical evidence from the stamping of bricks suggests that it was built primarily under Trajan and then finished under Hadrian towards the end of his reign. And just a little context, Hadrian is viewed as one of the most successful emperors of the Roman Empire during its kind of prime period. So what was the Pantheon's purpose? This is also shockingly up for debate as well. So originally it was believed to be a temple of the gods. Now it also may have been a dynastic sanctuary of a ruler cult. These ruler cults were common in Roman times, particularly the Augustan and Caesar one, which is what this is thought to have been dedicated to, because Caesar, first Roman emperor, was deified, and his lineage was deified as well. The location also has some sacred associations. So the site of the apotheosis, which is the raising up to the heavens of Romulus, Rome's founder, and it's also along the axis that aligned with the Campus Martius, where many temples and Augustus' mausoleum was built as well. Hadrian actually held court in this building during his reign once he completed it, and then in 608 CE, it was sacramented as a church, which is interesting as well, kind of how they use ancient architecture and just converted it pretty fully. So looking at the front facade here, I really like this building. I think it looks very interesting and very cool, and kind of I've been to Rome, but I actually don't think I went to this building, so it's something I'd want to go back to. A few things to note is that these columns here are Egyptian granite. So they're not marble like you'd see in a lot of Roman architecture or ancient Greek architecture, and they have no fluting like you'd also see in the Greek or Roman architecture. They're Corinthian capitals, and they're also not sections. That is one piece of stone. So all the marble columns that you see are sections, and this is one large piece of granite. You can see two pediments here as well. So the pediments, you can see this front one, and then on the back side, if you come forward from the barrel, you see the second pediment. The theory around that is that these very large granite columns were actually expected to be even higher. And when they showed up to Rome and they were finished, they were much shorter. And so there was a second pediment that was built. And then you can see this frieze here. I took Latin in high school, so I can attempt to read it, but it's not going to be as good as Sophie or Gabby. But it reads in Latin, Marcus Agrippa Lucii Filius Consul Tertium Fecit, or in English, Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, made, parentheses, this building when consul for the third time. And so then you can see the capitals here are Corinthian in order. And also an interesting thing to note that you can't really see from this image is that the Pantheon sits below street level. So there used to be steps up to this front facade, but now it's at street level and there's only this one small step because Rome has built up over time. So then looking to the dome here, on the right image, you see the coffers, which are these square sections on the interior of the dome. And we read about it, but I want to reiterate how interesting it is that they used 28 different sections, which was a perfect number. There was only 4 perfect numbers in mathematics known at the time in ancient history, and some people believe these numbers have mystical or religious meanings. And then you see that window at the top of the dome, which is called an oculus. That's the building's only source of direct sunlight. And there's a theory as well that it's a way to tell time as the light would shift throughout the day, and as well as some other astronomical movements as it would shift throughout the year. I'm going to come back to these images in a second, but I want to look at this section real quick. So the dome is a full half sphere, and the geometry of the building would actually allow a full sphere to fit into the building as seen in this slide. So it would actually not meet at the bottom in the center, it would meet at the beginning of the dome. So the geometry in this building is truly phenomenal. And then moving back just to this left image real quick. So the exterior top of the dome to me kind of stood out because it looks almost pyramid-like that we saw in other ancient structures. It has this stepping stone, and then the central portion is the rest of this rounded dome. But the weight of the concrete required that it be this stepped structure and not a full dome like you see in other more modern cathedrals, because the technology and knowledge just hadn't gotten there quite yet. And then you can see here that the walls of this massive barrel are made of the same brick and concrete that we discussed last week. So it's the Roman concrete that provides the structure to this building. It was originally thought to have been rectangular in structure, and it is now thought that it's been circular in its entirety. So, and the building also, interestingly enough, used to have a colonnade in front of it, and there would have been buildings on each side of it closer to than what is currently today. So you wouldn't actually have seen this rounded structure. This rounded structure isn't decorated because you wouldn't have seen it in ancient times. So then moving, here is just a quick plan talking about the radiality of this building. And then I'm going to move to another image about its, one second. Just like the inside. So this is, I'm going to talk about a lot. So here you can see, oh geez. Okay, I'm going to move here really quickly. So you walk in the entrance here and you see this apse in the back that you find in like modern cathedrals, and they also use it. So this alcove apse, it's almost an interchangeable term. And then you also have these little alcoves on all sides of the axis, and these small black dots that may be hard to make out are columns. So they're the columns in this image here. So this is a painting done by Giovanni Paolo Panini in 1734, and it's supposed to represent what the building looked like then and how it does not look like that anymore. So the niches you see in this image would have had statues, and the concrete barrel, as I talked about earlier, provides the entire structural support. So these columns are purely decorative. They are this red and purple marble with Corinthian capitals, and it's really a testament to Roman concrete that they could build such a large, vast building without the support of these columns, even though they look like they would be required to support such an amazing building. So due to only having the light come from the oculus, the building often feels dark and cold to a visitor. It's not necessarily represented in this image. This feels almost lighter, but it often, if you were to walk into it, it would feel rather dark. This would align with this dynastic cult theory, as emperors were simultaneously feared but also respected and then eventually deified at their death. So it's kind of this, it feels like powerful, and it's the statues that have that power. So of the original embellishments, the coffered ceiling of the dome, some of the marble interior that you can see in this image, a bronze grill over the entrance, and the bronze doors are the only things that have survived. You can also see here on these niches, the decorative marble behind the statues is purely geometric. So it's rectangular, squares, it's the circle that kind of matches the sphere of the building. And all of the original statues unfortunately disappeared. So we don't have a clear vision of what they were. But that's kind of when those theories come into play of what was it, Agrippa, was it Augustus? And there's also a chance that it was gods as well. So here's another plan real quick where you can see on the outside that there may have been a bunch of gods. And you can see Mars in the center here. Mars was a really important god to the Romans because he was god of war and strength and projecting strength. And so although Jupiter was the king of the gods, Mars was considered, one of the most important gods. And the design of the Pantheon is replicated throughout cities now and college campuses such as here as UVA. The Guggenheim Museum has a similar structure as well. So that's it.
Really great. This is a fantastic ending image, Matthew, because you can see how that dome at UVA, when it was constructed, it didn't need that stair stepping. Mm-hmm. But again, as we've seen so many times with those early Japanese granaries, for example, just the form of a thing takes on meaning beyond its functional use, right? So, yeah, nice work. Great. Questions, comments? Yeah, Pia. And then Lucas.
Well, I want to start to say that I really liked the presentation. I thought it was very thorough, so congrats. That was good. Also, another thing, I've been to Rome like 5 years ago, and I never noticed walking by the Pantheon. Like, I've never actually looked at it, and now throughout the presentation, I've actually noticed that it's just a beautiful architectural building. Like, I just want to go back there again, honestly.
So great. So great. Good. Lucas?
Yeah. I had a question about the Oculus. So probably didn't have glass back in the day covering it. Is there glass on it now, or like when it rains, it's going into the building and they've got to clean it?
It rains into the building. Yeah. It's amazing. But
yeah, just one other thing. So originally the Oculus wasn't there to its full extent. So it would have been open air during the times of Agrippa. And then because of the architectural innovations made in like the period of like 150 years, they were able to build that dome, the Oculus, which is interesting.
Great point. I also really appreciate, Matthew, how you pointed out that those interior columns are decorative and not structural. It kind of harkens to a Chthonic architectural form in that sense, and that lends credence to that kind of occult feeling that they were trying to cultivate. Good, Rosie, you had a point too. And then...
yeah, I also thought he did a really good job, and I thought it was interesting because when he showed the aerial view, it almost looked like an eye to me with like a pupil. I don't even know why, and it, like similar to how it's maybe a stretch, but similar to how like the eye literally lets you see and allows you to see light, like the little opening in the Oculus, like let the light in and shine on the gods. So I thought it was like an interesting comparison. I don't know if it was done on purpose to connection or if it's just me thinking of that, but yeah.
Yeah, great point. Matthew, do you have any feedback on that? Or
I don't. I actually had not thought of that. I actually really like that point. I hadn't really thought of that, but it is interesting how they really only chose to have one single source of light, kind of like up straight to the heavens, so.
And that building really predates our understanding of optics, which would give us that view that the pupil would be the place where the light comes in. So it's a really interesting point, Rosie, that something formative may have been there. Good. Ellen, you had a point as well.
I've been there, and I remember walking in the picture Matthew used with like the bubble, and I know it was in one of our readings too. Like it's really enormous in there, and it's just amazing. Like I don't understand how they did it. I don't understand how they made it like a perfect bubble, but it was beautiful. And also the day I went there, it was raining, and they just put up like little cones and made a little center, and you couldn't walk there.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you for that presentation, Matthew. Terrific.
Of course.
Okay, so thank you for handing it back to me already. Let's do a couple of things. Okay. Are you now, why am I not seeing this? Are you seeing my PowerPoint presentation? No, not at all. Thank you. Okay, let's try this again. How about now? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, let me open that up. Let's see, we've got about half an hour left. I'm going to run through this material on Brasilia because you have it in most of the videos and slides that were posted for yesterday. And because many of the presentations you've given today really hit on the key topics related to the construction of Brasilia. That being said, we're continuing this discussion about urban planning and master planned cities in the 20th century. Thinking about concrete, and then this idea of the lands of no man. This is a concept by Catherine McKittrick, that in order to create the motivation for development, oftentimes, particularly in the colonial period, a story or a narrative would be created that would say, well, no one lives here. No one's taking care of this space. We, wiser, smarter, often whiter ones, ought to just go in and do it ourselves. It's this construct. It's a false narrative. It's often projected onto things, even the land where Brasilia was built. So we'll get into that. And then, of course, we're looking at Oscar Niemeyer's work for Brasilia, and Lucia Costa was the master planner for the project. Here we are in Brazil. As we heard earlier, the government of Juscelino Kubitschek, who was then president of Brazil, is the one to have initiated the call for the design of Brasilia. He put out a call to international architects to submit proposals, send me your best work, show me what you got, and Lucia Costa won. So knowing that, this was his winning plan. What do you see when you look at it?
A bird.
Yeah, a bird. Great. Anything else? Lucas, yes.
But that's for the AV.
Yeah, exactly.
Bird.
A bird
design.
Yeah, great. All of those were in his idea for the original design. Another thing that surfaces in that design, which is called the Plan Piloto, is this kind of X marks the spot image, right? It's what you see on pirate maps. It's just, it's a cliche for us now. But in a way, what he was doing is marking out this new site as if it was on undiscovered territory, as if no one had ever lived there before, as if adventurers would come in and set up this whole new colony in the middle of the state of Brazil. That marking is, as Lucia Costa described it, the primary gesture of one who marks or takes possession of a place. And you can see it here in sort of the initial structuring of the roadways for Brasilia. I love the way this artist has portrayed that idea of a total blank slate on which Brasilia was built. This green, vast countryside where this sort of organized square of city planning and government organization would take shape. The idea for Brasilia was really to unite all of the larger regions of Brazil that didn't feel like they were well represented when the capital was in Rio. Rio is over here on the far coast. A lot of the older money, a lot of the older families, people who had colonial ties to Brazil had set up their structures of power, their businesses, everything right down here between Rio and Sao Paulo. And so to make a shift to really like restructure the country in terms of a new modern plan, Kubitschek took up a very old idea, as Gabby pointed out, that the head of government should be moved to the center of Brazil to better represent everyone. Okay, let me keep moving. So Brasilia was supposed to be like F. Scott Fitzgerald's vision of America when he describes it as the bright green breast of the New World. And you see that in the imagery that was used to celebrate and promote the idea of Brasilia. So in that image on the right, what comes to mind when you look at those figures, that imagery? What are they trying to portray? See, maybe Faifan or Christina?
It looks like two figures kind of both in their respective like uniforms or outfits that they're wearing. Kind of hard to tell like what those uniforms are for. And then standing in front of this like utopian looking skyline of a city. Yeah. That seems like it's the plan or something that has yet to be built, but an idea for it.
Yeah, great. Faifan, yeah.
And it seems like they're in a scaffolding shape. I don't know. Like it seems like they are still like in the building process.
Yes, totally. Those buildings, we're seeing them now in the haze kind of over on the left in the midst of construction. And those figures on the right, the two men represented on this billboard in the middle of the countryside. One is in a military uniform on the left, that's Vargas, who was sort of the first one to run on the idea that Brasilia should be created and this capital should exist in the countryside. And then we have Juscelino Kubitschek in the clothing of the Portuguese colonizers when they reached this so-called New World. Just weird imagery, right? Very patriarchal and it's got that whole founding of a new world ethos in it, literally. Okay, and then we won't go into this extensively because Gabby's done such a nice job in showing us the presidential palace. But looking at the architecture of Brasilia, what stands out just from these quick images?
It's very modern and low to the ground. Has a lot of geometry to it as well.
Yeah, it's a very horizontal architecture in some ways. Yeah, good point. And very geometric. Anything else, Lucas?
Like the curved, like lower to the ground shapes, that seems almost alien to me, like literally like a UFO.
Yeah, they totally do. It gives us all of that imagery from sci-fi movies, right? Great point. As if this was something, it was designed to be hyper modern, but this is really otherworldly in its forms. Great. Anything else on this? Okay, Brad and then Christina.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, everything is like so spaced out. Like, I think they might just be trying to, like, I don't know, like flex how much space they have compared to like maybe some of the more urban areas in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. They are really showing their expanse. Great illustration of that. Okay, good. Christina?
The use of water more as an architectural like ornamentation than as the natural element that it's sometimes used as.
Yeah, excellent. As we heard earlier too, in many of these master plan cities, water is used to aggrandize the architecture and add a kind of softness to counterbalance that hard concrete geometry. Yeah, good point. Also in that top image, you can see in a weird way the scale of the architecture compared to human beings. Particularly if you look at the little guys, I know they're small, but if you look at the little people on the ground over to the left in that top image, just how dwarfed they are by the scale of this architecture. This is not, as we saw with brick, it is in no way scaled to the human. None of these buildings, even Nehemiah's palace, had we not seen Gabby's images, it's really hard to figure out how tall is that first story, how monumental, small. It's hard to scale these. And that was done on purpose to create a really grand vision. whether you saw the buildings in person or not. Here's another image where just like people are dwarfed by these governmental structures, in a way symbolizing the way that this government, which was a dictatorship at the time and grew to be even more so, was not really built for the people, right? It was built on a very different scale, both ideologically and physically. Just a few more images that are fun. We won't go into developmentalist nationalism, but it's just this idea that you're forging everything new as if nothing existed before. Here's another image where you just see the difference between the human beings who are going to live in the city and the city itself. For many coming from any other city in Brazil or coming from the countryside, coming from farming communities, it was overwhelming to most of the people who would live and work there. And as you saw in some of the videos as prep for the class today, they weren't built into the structure of the city in a way that further alienated them from the architecture that was supposed to be representative of their national government. All right. One of the other things that draws back to that idea of the green lungs of the city is that the planning for Brasilia, as you saw in that, X amount of ways to not design a city video, the water structures, there was a damming process that created these lakes around Brasilia. And just as we saw in earlier examples, these lakes were intended to be the green lungs of the city. They would filter out the so-called unhygienic populations of the border and keep the city pure and clean. And in that, you should hear all of the racial and white supremacist overtones that were there because they were explicit at the time. Those green lungs now create kind of a beautiful landscaped park, but that park not only limited the growth of the city, it limited who was intended to be there. The scale of the city, which looks very much like an earlier image we saw of Chandigarh, the scale of the city was also not built for humans. It was built for cars. Cars were the new tech of the time, and they were celebrated in the layout of Brasilia. You can see how those highways, those major thoroughfares, really shape where the architecture can go, and more importantly, where the people can move within the city of Brasilia itself. You can see in the background here the super quadra that were built for people to live in, and you heard in that video just the way that setting up neighborhoods that were only neighborhoods created lots of problems in terms of theft. If everyone who worked in the city lived in these outer neighborhoods, and when they went to work during the day, no one was at the homes, and there's no intermixing of like grocery stores in the region or other things where there would be people around all day, it's just creating a problem that wouldn't have existed in an otherwise sort of self-emerging city where things would be mixed together. So take a minute with this image. What stands out when you look at it?
It's very geometrical, modern, but at the same time has like natural features to it. There's a lot of green, and also the color of the buildings kind of resemble the green territory in the middle. So
yeah,
kind of some natural features as well.
Yeah, good point. Good point. That glass actually helps increase the green view of the city from the air. Good. What else?
The buildings are identical and they're spaced the same directly across from each other. And you can see on the outer edges of both sides, there's another building, and those are also the same.
Yeah, a lot of repetition. A whole lot of repetition. Good. Okay, Sophie, and then Lucas, and then Matthew.
Yeah, I was going to say it's kind of like an axial plan because not only are the buildings like the same, but like if you look from east to west, it's like almost exactly the same, like even the buildings further on the outskirts. So they've really tried to make it completely symmetrical.
Yeah, great point about the axial plan. Terrific. Okay, Lucas?
Yeah. What I noticed going across the quads are like the paved paths, but they're not symmetrical. It's the only piece in this entire image that I can see that isn't symmetrical. I feel like there should be an extra path going across the bottom of like the top quad. Yeah, just to like, it's kind of my OCD kicking in there.
Yeah. It messes with you a little bit. Okay, good. We'll come right back to that, but I want to give Matthew a chance to raise his point as well.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's interesting. You can kind of see. So like, I'm pretty sure that big white building in the center back is the Congress. I think we looked at it a few images ago, and it's fascinating. Like, it just, there's nothing behind it. They like intentionally, there's just this green that's nothing behind it. And I had one other comment I was going to make about Niemeyer, which is like, we learned about in the podcast how he was, communist until like the day he died. And I wonder if that was partially in his like motivations to build these like newer modern buildings and like not go into like the neoclassical, democratic view that like the White House takes and a lot of other large, government buildings take in much of Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. There was this idea that the way Brazil was laid out with all of the repetition and all of the sameness, that there was some sort of new form of equality there, or equanimity at least across the board. And that was in Niemeyer's. We need to sort of take Niemeyer out of the picture when we talk about sort of the heavy-handed design of the city. Niemeyer really had a utopian vision that he was hoping to see realized. So great point. Okay, back to Lucas's point about these pathways in the middle that are just kind of like doing their own zigzags and they're not structured in the way that the rest was. Clarissa Toussaint did a study of exactly those paths. Those are the footpaths of the people who lived in the city, who were exhausted by the fact that the only way that they could get somewhere in the original design of the city was to walk these huge super blocks to get somewhere. And of course, they just made their own paths from one part of the inner core of the city to the other. And to really celebrate these, she did a series of artworks that highlight those footpaths, highlight the way that the people did everything they could to overcome that superstructure that was built into Brasilia from the beginning. Another form of artistic protest is in the work of Marcel Gauthiero's images of Sacolandia, which is just like sack land, where the people who were not, the people for whom the city was not designed had to come up with their own structures and their own ways of living. And in this case, they're sad images of people who have created their own structures out of the sackcloths for their basic commodity goods. And it's just one image of the failure of the city planning of Brazil, that it didn't include housing for the people who were needed to be janitors, to handle the elevator service, all the things that made the city run, and they weren't included in the design. Another thing that we see in this image, they're tiny, but along the side you see these little white and blue kind of little squares. These are tent structures where vendors brought food, drinks, a sense of leisure, and actual attending to bodily needs in a way that hadn't been accounted for either. There were not restaurants in this part of the city. And so anyone who worked here in these functionary buildings for the state, if they were going to eat, they'd need to get back in their cars, go somewhere else, or have brought their lunches with them, or a million different things. But this is another way that the people in the city just said, no, we'll just do this ourselves. And lots of vendors have come in and brought necessary resources and pleasure to this part of the city as well. So that, going back to that original billboard image with Kubitschek there in his Portuguese colonial garb and the military outfit of Vargas, of course, that X marks the spot plan for Brasilia didn't happen on a clean slate. There were a vast amount of indigenous populations, the First Nations of Brazil, who had long inhabited the region where Brasilia was built, as well as the outer countryside that was impacted by the development of Brasilia. And what we're looking at here is images of protest from 2018 with the election of Bolsonaro, who is now the president of Brazil. He's often considered a close parallel to Trump in his ideology and his mode of government. And the people of the First Nations came out to protest, not only because the land that the government is sitting on is theirs and has never been acknowledged as such, but also because of the plans Bolsonaro had for clearing large parts of the Amazon where these people still lived and thrived. So it's just one more way that populations, as we see right now with the Black Lives Matter movement, fill in the space that was not meant to accommodate them. These images went viral on Instagram and all other forms, really, of those groups taking over the Capitol and really trying to bring international attention to their plight. Let's see. Okay. We have 7 minutes for this project, but I'm going to break you into groups to do it. Take only whatever part you can manage for right now. I've set up a Google Doc where what I'm asking you to do is imagine that you and your colleagues in your small group are now occupiers of a new nation. You can set up a capital in any way you want. You can occupy DC, you can set up something new, pick your place. So just write down kind of what your ideology is. You're gonna have to formulate this quickly. Where you want your capital to be, and then come up with an architectural style. You don't have to draw it out because we don't have time, but come up with an architectural style that's going to represent your new nation. So I'm going to, for those of you who are viewing this asynchronously, I will send you a link to the doc where you can fill in your ideas. You can either do them as a group or you can do them individually. This is just for participation, for fun. Have a good time with it. You can see what the other groups have done to help kind of guide what's going on. All right, let me know if you have any questions.